They thought the distance would diminish you. That is the honest starting point for this. The avoidant who creates distance, who withdraws, who cools, who manages the connection back to something they can control, is not always consciously aware of this, but embedded in the pattern is a specific assumption about what the distance will produce in the other person. The assumption is that the distance will teach, will communicate something about the avoidance value through its demonstration of the avoidance absence, will produce in the other person the specific, clarifying experience of what life is like without the avoidance presence and warmth, such that when the warmth eventually returns, it is received with greater appreciation, less expectation, more willingness to accept what is offered without pressing for what is not. The distance as implicit instruction, the withdrawal as the lesson that the other person's investment was perhaps too confident, too certain, too insufficiently aware of how fortunate they were to have the avoidance attention at all. This is not always conscious. It is often the pre-deliberate expression of a pattern that produces the distance for other reasons. The fear, the architecture, the nervous system's response to genuine intimacy becoming genuinely threatening. But underneath the fear-driven withdrawal, there is often also the specific, quiet, not fully examined assumption that the distance will produce the desired result of greater appreciation and reduced demand. The avoidant thought the distance would be instructive. What they did not anticipate is what it would actually produce. What it actually produced is worth examining honestly. The distance produced the empath's reclamation of themselves. Not immediately, not cleanly, not as the deliberate, decided response of someone who saw clearly what was happening and made the strategic choice to redirect their energy elsewhere, as the gradual, honest, eventually arrived at recognition that the reaching was not producing genuine reciprocity, and that the resources being spent on the reaching belonged more honestly to the person's own genuine life. The distance produced the conditions in which the empath did the interior work, sat with the honest accounting of what the dynamic was and was not providing, restored the trust in their own perception that the dynamic's ambiguity had been quietly eroding, returned to themselves in the genuine, non-performed, actually inhabiting my own life way that produces the specific quality of person who is simply, completely, honestly themselves. The distance produced the empath's genuine development. And the avoidant, having assumed the distance would produce appreciation, found something considerably more unexpected when they eventually encountered the person they thought they were teaching. The humbling is not what the avoidant expected their lesson to produce. They expected to return, or to make the conditions of return available, and find someone who was more grateful for the warmth, more willing to accept what was offered, more organized around the avoidance availability as the primary concern of their interior. They found instead someone who was not organized around the avoidance availability at all, not in the performed, strategic way of someone who has decided to appear less interested, in the genuine, actually true, my life is genuinely full way of someone whose primary orientation had authentically shifted toward their own genuine life. The empath was warmer than before, and less organized around the avoidant than before, both simultaneously. The combination was not what the lesson was supposed to produce. Warmth without need. Genuine care without the specific organizing hunger for the avoidance reciprocity that the pattern had been calibrated to manage. The specific, rare, cannot be manufactured quality of someone who genuinely loves without requiring the love to be returned in any particular form in order to maintain their own interior stability. That quality, warmth without need, genuine care without organizing hunger, is the thing the avoidance pattern has the least adequate response to, has been described throughout this conversation in various forms. The authentic presence that reaches the defended interior not because it is targeting the defense, but because it is simply genuine, and the defense has no protocol for genuine. The avoidant, expecting to return to someone who had been instructed by the distance into greater appreciation and reduced expectation, found instead the fuller version of exactly the thing that their defended interior could never prevent itself from recognizing as real. The empath more completely themselves, more honestly inhabiting their own life, more genuinely self-possessing, more warmly present without the anxious orientation toward the connection's direction that the original dynamic contained. The lesson backfired, not as punishment, as the honest consequence of the distance having produced something the avoidant did not plan for and could not have predicted from within the defended logic of the pattern. The humbling is real, worth naming honestly rather than with the satisfaction of vindication. The avoidant, encountering the fuller version of the empath, encountering the specific quality of someone who has genuinely done the interior work and is living from the genuine results, is encountering the honest reflection of what their pattern produced, not the reduced, grateful, less demanding version they were expecting. The more complete, more genuinely self-possessed, more honestly themselves version that genuine interior work produces in someone who moves through difficult experience honestly. That encounter is humbling in the specific sense of genuine humility, not the performed humility of someone who has decided to be gracious, the involuntary, I did not anticipate this, genuine recognition of having underestimated something. Having underestimated the person, their depth, their capacity to move through what the pattern produced and emerge from it more fully themselves. Their ability to take the distance that was supposed to diminish them and use it as the conditions for genuine reclamation. Having underestimated what genuine love is capable of, not in the romantic sense, in the psychological sense, the specific capacity of someone who loves genuinely to metabolize difficulty honestly and arrive on the other side of it with the loving intact and the self more completely developed. Having underestimated the cost of the pattern, not the cost to the avoidant, that has been landing in the forms described throughout this conversation, the cost to the person, which turned out to be real and significant, and produced real and significant interior work, that produced real and significant genuine development. The avoidant thought the distance was a lesson they were delivering. It turned out to be a lesson they were receiving. What the lesson the avoidant received actually contains, what the humbling is honestly teaching, is worth examining without the satisfaction of vindication. Because the point is not the avoidant being humbled as a satisfying outcome. The point is what genuine humbling, when it is real rather than performed, actually opens up in a person's interior. Genuine humility, the kind that arrives from genuinely encountering something you underestimated, has a specific quality. It is not the shame of having been wrong. It is the specific, clarifying, actually useful recognition of having operated from an inaccurate model, of having assumed something about how the world works that the actual world has now contradicted. The avoidance model said, the distance will produce diminishment. The actual world produced the opposite. The model was wrong. And the wrongness of the model is not merely an interesting data point. It is the direct, experiential, cannot be explained away evidence that the pattern's operating assumptions about the people it engages with are not accurate. The pattern assumed the other person's orientation toward the connection was a stable feature of the dynamic, rather than the ongoing, renewable, could genuinely redirect choice of a real person with a real interior. The pattern assumed the empath's genuine love was a resource that would remain available regardless of what the pattern produced. The pattern assumed the distance's lesson would be received as the pattern intended it to be received. All of those assumptions were wrong. The genuine humbling is the honest recognition of that wrongness, not as self-punishment, as the clearing of inaccurate operating premises, as the making available of something more accurate to replace what the wrongness revealed. What is more accurate in the honest accounting that genuine humbling makes possible is simply this. The people who love genuinely are not resources to be managed, are not stable features of a dynamic whose availability can be assumed regardless of what the dynamic produces, are real people with real interiors and real capacity for genuine development, and real ability to take the distance that was supposed to diminish them and use it as the conditions for becoming more fully themselves. The pattern does not produce the lesson it intends, it produces the actual consequences of its actual operation, which are different from what the pattern's internal logic suggests they will be when the person on the receiving end of the pattern is someone with genuine depth and genuine capacity for honest interior work. The avoidant thought they were teaching. They got taught instead, not by the empath's deliberate instruction, by the honest, natural, this is what genuine people do with genuine difficulty consequence of someone who moved through what the pattern produced honestly and emerged more completely themselves. The person who was supposed to be diminished by the distance is not diminished, is more fully themselves than they were before it, warmer, more grounded, more honestly inhabiting the genuine life that was always genuinely theirs, not as the outcome of a strategy, as the honest result of genuine interior work done in the conditions the distance created. The distance was supposed to be the lesson. It became the education. And the education belongs to the person who received it, permanently, in the ordinary days that are the whole of it. The humbling that arrives in the avoidance interior after the distance produced something other than what the distance was supposed to produce is not a single moment of recognition. That deserves honest examination, rather than the clean narrative of someone encountering a revelation and being changed by it. The humbling arrives gradually. In the specific, accumulating, this keeps being true way of evidence that contradicts an operating premise not through a single dramatic contradiction, but through the sustained, repeated, cannot be finally explained away quality of a world that keeps not behaving according to the model. The model said the distance would produce a more manageable version of the empath. The empath encountered in the aftermath of the distance is less manageable in the specific sense of being less organized around the avoidance availability as a primary concern, more genuinely self-possessed, more honestly inhabiting their own life, more warmly present, without the specific organizing orientation toward the connection that the pattern had been calibrated to manage. Each encounter with this version contradicts the model again. The accumulation of contradictions is the genuine humbling, not the single moment of recognition. The sustained, undeniable, this is simply true quality of repeated, honest evidence. What the avoidant does with the humbling is the genuine question, and here it deserves honest treatment, rather than the satisfying narrative of someone who was humbled and therefore changed. Humbling and change are not the same thing. Genuine humility, the honest recognition of having operated from inaccurate premises, is a precondition for change. It is not change itself. The gap between the recognition and the sustained behavioral expression of something different is the entire territory that this conversation has been examining throughout. Some avoidants, genuinely humbled by the honest evidence of what their distance actually produced, find in the humbling the specific motivation that previous phases of the dynamic could not generate. The motivation that is organized not around the restoration of what was lost, but around the genuine questioning of why the loss happened, why the operating premises were inaccurate, what it means about the pattern and the architecture, and the specific developmental work that the honest recognition of the premises' failure points toward. That questioning, if it is genuine and sustained, is the beginning of something more real than the acute motivation of regret or the reactive behavior of loss pressure. It is the beginning of honest engagement with what the pattern actually is and why it operates as it does, and what changing it would genuinely require. Other avoidants encounter the humbling, and the management finds new forms that accommodate the recognition without requiring the fundamental premises to be genuinely revised. The recognition is absorbed. The model is updated in small, local ways that explain the specific outcome without challenging the broader operating assumptions. The empath's development is attributed to circumstances or to the empath's own particular qualities rather than to the honest consequence of the pattern's operation. The lesson the distance was supposed to teach becomes, in the management's revised narrative, evidence of the empath's exceptional character, rather than evidence of the pattern's inaccurate operating model. The person does not need to monitor which of those outcomes is occurring in the avoidance interior. That has been the consistent, honest position of this conversation throughout, and it remains so here. The avoidance interior process, whatever it is, wherever it goes, however it engages or fails to engage with the genuine humbling the distance produced, belongs to the avoidant. What deserves honest examination is what the humbling means for the person who was supposed to be diminished and was not. The person who was not diminished by what was supposed to diminish them has learned something specific about themselves through the experience, not as a lesson they were seeking, as the honest, experientially confirmed knowledge that arrives through the actual living of difficult things, rather than through the theoretical understanding of them. They learned that genuine interior work is more durable than the pattern's operating assumptions about the people who do it. That someone who loves genuinely and metabolizes difficulty honestly does not emerge diminished, emerges more completely themselves, with the specific, genuine, hard-won qualities that can only be developed through the actual living of difficult experience, not the simulation of it, not the avoidance of it, not the management of it into something more comfortable, but the genuine, patient, honest engagement with it. That knowledge is not abstract, is embodied, is the specific, felt, this is what I actually know because I actually lived it quality of genuine self-knowledge, which is different in character from everything that can be learned about oneself through easier means. The person also learned something specific about the nature of genuine love, not the romantic version, the psychological, honest, practically significant version. Genuine love does not diminish the person who loves. When it is expressed in conditions that return it inadequately, when it is given genuinely to someone whose capacity to receive it adequately is limited by the architecture surrounding their heart, it produces the specific difficulty of giving into insufficient conditions. That difficulty is real, and its cost is real. But the love itself, genuinely expressed, does not erode the person who expresses it, does not reduce their capacity for depth or warmth or honest self-knowledge, does not leave them smaller than they were before. It tends, when metabolized honestly rather than either suppressed or endlessly performed, to produce more of what the person genuinely already was, more depth, more honest self-knowledge, more genuine warmth that is now more completely inhabiting itself because the difficult experience gave it something real to metabolize. The avoidance distance was supposed to teach the empath something about the avoidance value. What it actually taught the empath was something about their own. Not as the conclusion that arrived cleanly at the end of a period of reflection, as the gradual, honest, lived into knowing of someone who kept showing up for themselves through difficult conditions, and found, in the showing up, that what they are is genuinely more substantial than the difficult conditions were able to diminish. That knowing, specific, earned, embodied, is what the person carries out of the experience that the avoidant thought was a lesson they were delivering. It is not carried triumphantly, is not the vindication of someone who has won something, is the quiet, settled, genuinely mine quality of knowledge that belongs permanently to the person who arrived at it through genuine experience. It lives in the ordinary days, in the specific quality of how the person engages with their own life now, in the warmth that is more completely itself, in the self-possession that is more genuinely grounded, in the honest perception that is more confidently trusted, in the ordinary hours of a life that is more genuinely inhabited. None of it performing anything, none of it aimed at communicating anything to the avoidant or to anyone else. Simply the honest condition of a person who went through something real and came out on the other side more completely themselves. The avoidant, encountering this person, is encountering the honest consequence of their own pattern's operation, not as a punishment, as the straightforward, this is simply what happened reality of what the distance actually produced. And whether that encountering produces genuine humbling that becomes genuine reckoning, that becomes genuine interior work, that becomes genuine behavioral change, or whether it is managed into something the defended life can accommodate without requiring the fundamental premises to be honestly revised, is the avoidant's own question to answer, in their own interior, on their own timeline, through their own genuine choosing. The person is not waiting for the answer, is living their life in the ordinary days that are genuinely, completely, without condition, theirs, as they have always been, as they will continue to be, regardless of what the avoidant does with what the distance produced. The distance was supposed to be a lesson. It became the conditions for the person's genuine development. And that development belongs to the person, permanently, completely, in the full, honest, ordinary quality of a life that is genuinely theirs, right now, which is where everything real has always been, and remains. The ordinary days continue. That is the honest place to return to. Not because everything that has been examined throughout this conversation was without value. Much of it was genuine and worth saying. But because there is a point where more words about the avoidance interior, more analysis of what the dynamic produced, more psychological examination of what the humbling means and what the development contains, more of all of that begins to serve the examination rather than the person. And the person is not the examination. The person is a human being who went through something genuinely difficult and has done genuine work on themselves and is living their actual life in the actual present. That life does not require further articulation to be real, does not require more psychological framing to be worth inhabiting, does not require the continued analysis of what was survived to be genuinely, presently, completely itself. There is something honest worth acknowledging about this conversation as a whole. It has covered genuine psychological territory, the architecture of avoidant attachment, the specific dynamics of empath-avoidant connection, the signals of genuine bonding, the cost of the pattern, the reclamation of the self, the ordinary days as the whole of the thing. That content is real and reasonably accurate and genuinely useful for someone navigating the specific experience. And conversations of this kind, however well-intentioned, can also become their own form of organization around the avoidant, can become the ongoing project of understanding the avoidant psychology more thoroughly, reading the signals more accurately, comprehending the interior process more completely, which is, in a specific sense, still the orientation toward the avoidant as the primary subject of the interior's engaged attention. The person who is genuinely reclaiming themselves does not need to understand the avoidant psychology more completely. Already has the understanding that is genuinely useful. What they need, what actually serves the genuine reclamation, is simpler than more analysis. Simply their own life, their own genuine attention directed at what is actually presently really there. What is actually presently really there is not the avoidance interior process, is not the ongoing examination of what the distance produced and what the humbling means and what the development contains. It is the actual Tuesday, the specific people in the actual life, the work that is actually engaging, the genuine friendship that is actually available, the creative or intellectual engagement that actually absorbs, the quiet, particular, ordinary texture of a life that is genuinely present right now. That life deserves the person's genuine attention, more than this conversation does. Not because this conversation was worthless, because genuine inhabitation of the actual life is more valuable than the most thorough psychological understanding of why the last dynamic was painful. The development is real. The reclamation is real. The person being more completely themselves is real. None of that requires more words to be true. What it requires is the person's genuine presence to their own actual experience, in the ordinary hours, without the ongoing examination of the psychology serving as the alternative to that presence. The ordinary days are the whole of it. That has been said throughout this conversation in many forms. The most honest expression of it is the simplest one. Put down the analysis. Live the actual day. That is genuinely enough. That has always been genuinely enough. Right now.